You gotta keep it going. Boots and cats and Podpodcastcast, and we're back and we're gonna do a show for you and talk about.
Have you ever heard of Tempo?
I'm trying to rap.
He is not. He has never been more of a white boy. You've never been more of a white boy.
Welcome to Podpodcastcast. Hello and welcome to Podpodcastcast. It's a podcast where we review podcasts. I'm Sam.
I'm Honor.
Honor, that was a good intro for you.
Thanks.
And today we're joined by a very special guest.
Mm-hmm.
She's known worldwide. I might even say across the solar system, beyond the great, galactic divide.
For sure.
Magnanimous.
Easily. Wow.
Tall, strong, made of metal, has laser vision.
Yeah, man. Not even funny?
But really funny. Really funny. And my girlfriend, Genny. Hi, Genny.
Hello.
Hi, Genny.
Hello, everyone.
Was that good? Did I do what you wanted? I described you as a 20-foot tall robot. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. It was funny because Sam was like, how do you want to be introduced? And I said, I don't know. I think it'd be funny if you showered me in compliments. And those are the ones he came up with.
I couldn't think of anything else.
I feel like you just thought of a bunch of like Super Smash Bros. Power-ups.
Yeah, that's true. I was thinking of Metal Mario that whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jen. I'm sorry that this is your first time on the podcast. And, probably not my most stellar intro, but I feel like you've probably expected that. You've listened to the podcast. I'm basically podcasting all the time to you.
This is true.
Yes. I am aware of this.
Yeah. So I don't feel like of anybody you were really surprised that that's what I came up with.
I suppose not. I suppose.
Did you see how wistfully she looked there?
Yeah.
I don't...
She's just kind of staring up at the ceiling a little bit, kind of at an angle.
Yeah, well... and if there's a weird energy on the pod today, guys, it's because you're getting a little bit of a lower sound. We are all physically really low to the ground because Genny came in and lowered her chair as far as it would go.
Mm-hmm. I said as far as it would go.
That's as far as it would go. Oh.
It is now as far as it would go.
Let me join.
Let's lower. Oh, I was always as far as it would go.
It was only like half of an inch lower.
I feel like
ground.
we're basically doing this episode crisscross applesauce on the ground.
Isn't
That's
awesome?
the dream.
It's kind of got like slumber party vibes. You know?
Yeah, it's more comfy, more cozy, more down to earth. That's what people say about this podcast. It's not down to earth enough. It's a little too. It's a little too produced. A little too
high quality. That is
too
actually
high and mighty.
Honor, I've been meaning to tell you. Our biggest piece of feedback in the inbox. It's too good.
Too good?
Tone it down, guys.
Okay.
Joe Rogan's been hitting us up. Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen, they said, hey, you remember we had that podcast? You're making us feel bad.
Yeah.
Please, everyone's saying, just make it worse. And, hey, you ask listeners, we respond.
Yeah.
We're making it worse. We
are servants of the people.
I don't know if I go along with that.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah. Well,
because you hate the people.
I hate the people.
Sam hates his fans, by the way.
Yeah. It's an election year. Everyone's trying to get votes. I'm trying to get anti-votes. You know what I mean?
Always.
I'm trying to get the most people to like not vote for me,
Yeah.
Like anti-matter,
Yeah.
Try to...
We can help. Jenny and I will beat you up after this.
Thank you, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. This is really what I've been wanting. And the only other thing I've been wanting recently is to talk about my podcast.
Yeah.
So recently, and I think I've discussed this with both of you, I got a piece of feedback for Podpodcastcast that was, we don't cover enough podcasts for the girlies. Okay, we're not representing the girlies. And, I've said this for a long time. I'm a girl ally. Okay,
Yeah,
I'm a feminist.
Gal-lie?
A gal-lie, thank you. This
A
is why we have the pun
gal-lie.
machine on the
You're a
podcast today.
genius, Genny.
It's also kind of funny because I don't know if I should take credit for this. I didn't necessarily say this as much. I was just like, have you considered, Sam, doing other podcasts to cover other niches? Like maybe not just the nerd niche.
Yes. You're like, what if,
I didn't say for the girlies. I was just like that
Yes.
I'd be interested in. And the problem
Yeah.
is he overcorrected. And
I
have-
overcorrected?
I have never listened to your podcast, which I'm refraining for naming to not steal your thunder.
The podcast I listened to was called Call Her Daddy, which is supposedly the most popular podcast among women. They put that everywhere. Call Her Daddy is supposed to be the most popular podcast among women, but also the second most popular podcast, period. Call Her Daddy is hard to define. This is kind of in some respects been my white whale. I haven't been tracking it for that long, but it's been really hard to pin down. I haven't. It's so hard to describe Call Her Daddy. So I'm gonna try in a few attempts here. Firstly, Call Her Daddy is a talk show podcast hosted by Alex Cooper. It's a talk show where she gets celebrity guests on and promotes whatever thing they want to talk about. But it's also a show where she gives listeners advice that come in. Like some episodes are just advice. Like she's like, "Hey, Sunday sessions, welcome," and she'll give people advice. There's some episodes which are like, "Has your man been cheating? We're gonna talk to an expert on cheating.
Wow.
What's up with that?" And so it's not entirely one genre, and it has this vague theme of women's issues, which in some respects means like actual like women's political issues that are like important,
Yeah.
but also like, are guys hot? Like it does in some respects just have like sleepover vibes, such as this podcast where it's just sometimes girls like talking about whatever, talking about what's going on in their lives. And so for me, it kind of it defies a little bit of definition because it's not really. I hate to give the spoiler here. It's not really a great celebrity interview podcast, even though that's most of the episodes. Yeah. Alex Cooper's not a great interviewer. She's not got like really well researched questions. She's not like the top of the top reporter. She's also not terribly funny.
Interesting.
So
a hot take.
So I was kind of getting into Call Her Daddy, and I'm trying to understand it. I'm like, what is this? Because I like listened to 4, 5, 6 episodes, and I still am like, I don't understand what this podcast is. Like, I don't know how to describe this to another person. Yet I do know that like it's invaded my thinking, and now everything is like I frame in the form of a toxic relationship, Like now I'm just giving advice to everyone, being like, I don't know about that. I don't know if I would go to that restaurant. You and that restaurant have a toxic relationship. Think about it. They keep drawing you back in. I did this to you recently.
I was about to say I'm laughing because I'm realizing now that you did this to me.
I did it.
This is real, listener. This real effect has taken place over Sam.
Anna was talking about their job. And I was like, girl, don't do it. Don't go back. And so it's not like I haven't enjoyed it, but I also don't know if it's good. It was very strange as I kind of kept digging deeper. And I also consistently, I've had this experience while listening to it. Am I not getting the most out of this because I'm not a woman?
I was about to say, you might be, and sorry to say this, not the target audience.
Yeah.
Certainly I'm not, but I still couldn't get a whole picture of it in my head. There's podcasts I've listened to, and I'm like, okay, I get what this is, and I understand that it's not for me.
It kind of sounds, just from the way you're describing it, almost a return to form of like the radio, in which like it's just people doing things. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's not always the same through line. But if you like syndicated radio, like my mom does, like the Kid Craddock morning show, they'll sometimes occasionally interview someone, but also they have like some running bits, some advice, love letters to Kelly, in which Kelly, the love expert, tells them what to, like, people write in about like in need relationship advice, and it's just like it's it's like 4 hours worth of content, and they're just doing random stuff. There's game shows, like all this other stuff, you know? It's just a radio show. It's a return to form almost. In a
Democratic
new
radio
era.
sounds awesome.
It's fine. You know, there's characters. It's fine. Yeah,
right.
my mom really likes it. I like it fine.
Yeah, maybe that is. Maybe it's just truly like we've come full circle and it's like radio, like this isn't one thing. You know, there's so many podcasts that are so niche. They're
Yes.
like, I listen to the same album every day for 3 years and now I'm going to make a podcast about it, right?
Uh-huh.
So maybe that's what it is, but it still feels almost what you've described feels like a variety show. And I think I know how to categorize that, but this, I don't know. I didn't totally understand it. And you might have been waiting for me to talk about this. If you've heard about Call Her Daddy recently, it's likely because Alex Cooper interviewed sitting Vice President Kamala Harris.
Oh.
This was big in the news, really, really big. And she sat down with her for 40 minutes, had a long form interview, and talked about. At the start of the podcast, she was like, "I was going to ask her all these questions about foreign policy and the economy," and then Alex was like, "I got to be straight with you guys. That is not what it's not my area of expertise. I'm not talking about that." So they talked more about like abortion and like also like, what is your family life like, Kamala? Like, you know, where were you raised? What is it like to be a stepmom? You know, like all this kind of stuff. So this was really big news. And so I listened to that, a fine interview, but then I started thinking, how did this happen? Like, how did this podcast go from however it was created to interviewing a presidential candidate, right?
Yeah.
So I went back.
Oh, I was hoping you would.
I went way back in the Wayback Machine from archive.org, and I went back to the first episode. And you know what I found out on the first episode?
What'd you find out?
Alex had a co-host. Sophia.
Ooh. Oh, wait, I think I knew this.
And then she killed her?
To death. No.
Ha!
More dramatic than that.
Killed to death.
Whoa.
More dramatic.
Alex and Sophia start this podcast while they're living in New York, and it's just them talking, gabbing. They talk about their lives, but most notably, even I listened to the first 2 episodes, you can even see from then, Call Her Daddy was a sex podcast. That's what it was about. It was about, they're like 23 when this podcast starts, and they're just like talking about the craziest like sex stories, like the craziest relationship stories. And that's what fuels the conversation, the engine, and the interest. And I listened to these first episodes and I go, aha, okay, I get it. That is so, they have one topic, they talk about other things, but that's the main thing that they talk about. That's the thing that they care about. And I'm like, okay, I'm getting a picture here. I'm getting a picture. Alex and Sophia kind of bounce off each other in what I might describe as the most sorority girl fashion. They just, I don't know that I've ever had conversations like this where they like unironically use terms like slay or like I can't even, you know, there's just a lot of these. I can't think of any real good ones right now.
I can't even is pretty good.
Yeah. Oh, they say phrases like I'm dead a lot, you know, and it's not like a parody. This is just how they talk, and that's fine. But it does really feel very much like 2 skinny blonde girls going at it. Like that's the strong vibe here, right? But I understand. I get it. It's a sex podcast. This makes sense. I'm on the Wikipedia. I'm learning about the history. There was an incident. I skip forward in the chronology to the incident. The first episode where neither Sophia nor Alex is on the podcast.
What?
But a different guy. I forget.
A guy?
A man. I know. Very disappointing. I forget what the guy's name is, but you can Google him. I think his name is Dave. He's the owner of Barstool Media. And then this is where he explains what's been going on. Because at this point, he's like, all right, Daddy Gang. That's what they're called, by the way. The listeners of Call Her Daddy are called Daddy Gang. I hate that.
We need a name for our listeners.
No, we don't. Daddy Gang has convinced me that they shall remain nameless. I will never have a presidential candidate say some version of Daddy Gang about my podcast.
Email in. Tell
Isn't
us
that
what
the
you want to be
ultimate
called,
power move?
listeners.
It was tough. It was tough to listen to Kamala Harris say, and that's okay, Daddy Gang. It's that.
That's kind of awesome.
Isn't that how you know you made it?
Yeah, that is.
So the owner of Barstool comes on.
Yeah.
And he explains this drama that's been happening because at this point in the podcast, the weekly episodes have stopped and they've been off the air for like 5 weeks.
Oh,
And at this
a
point,
lot
it's
of weeks.
already a huge podcast. And he says, okay, hi, I'm the owner of Barstool. I think my name is Dave, but I don't know. And just so you guys know, Alex and Sophia sold Call Her Daddy to us like a year ago or something for a 3-year contract. And they would work for us and we would promote them and they would make their podcast. Now their podcast is very successful. And they're trying to renegotiate their contract. They're trying to get out of the contract and they're trying to get the IP back from us because they now own Call Her Daddy. And so all this drama unfolds involving Sophia's boyfriend, who they call Suit.
Whoa.
That's what the girls call
Whoa,
him.
they're like Sex in the City.
Sure.
I believe you.
Yeah.
And so apparently Sophia and Sophia's boyfriend were like, we can get more money. Sophia's boyfriend is in Hollywood and he's trying to negotiate this deal with this other podcast network to sell them Call Her Daddy. And this whole thing gets like blown way up. They stop working. Sophia and Alex essentially go on strike, trying to negotiate this deal to be like, hey, no, we want our podcast back. And the guy Barstool's like, no, you can't. You signed a contract.
Mhm.
You just can't. And so what ends up happening is that it's during the pandemic. It's 2020. And so the Barstool owner guy says, hey, okay, if you just come back after a year, you guys can have the IP back. You guys can own Call Her Daddy outright.
Wow.
And yeah, I'll also give you a raise or whatever. And it's also not like they're not making a lot of money. They're making like $500,000. They're doing fine.
Wow. Though also I wonder how much the whole podcast overall was making. You know what I mean?
Probably a lot.
They probably want a big cut of their whole idea.
True. So then Sophia's like, no, we'll never do that deal. That's crazy. And then Alex is like, that's crazy not to do this deal. I just get to own the podcast and also get more money. I'm going to do that. And so then Sophia gets cut out. She's out. Sophia, now spinning off adrift, has her own podcast called, I think, Sophia with an F. I think that's what it's called. I listened to a little bit of it where she talked to Lil Yachty, Lil Wayne, Lil Uzi Vert, maybe? One of the Lils.
Uh-huh.
Not a good podcast.
Oh, interesting.
That guy was not on that studio like having a good time. He was just like, hey, yo, like not interested.
Ad-libbing?
He was ad-libbing, as you like to do, Genevieve.
Calling back to the ad-libs that you can't cut now because we made a callback.
Oh, got him.
So Sophia's doing her own thing. And I'm going to say, maybe I'll go down farther because I'm kind of in the Call Her Daddy lore. Not very good. So Alex comes back. I listened to some episodes after that one, and she's like, I'm a single father now. I'm grieving. They also call themselves fathers. She's like, hello, I am your father.
because they're daddies.
Yes.
That makes it so much more sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I just thought I should explain.
If
It.
you're supposed to call her daddy, then of course they're fathers, you know?
Yeah, naturally.
Yeah.
Now, after that, she comes back. Alex, solo. Is like, hey, there was kind of a toxic relationship. There was a lot of things that weren't going well. There's a whole like trauma dump, all this kind of stuff. And she's like, we're going to do things differently. I want to get, more people on here, more celebs, yada, yada. You see the groundwork for the modern episodes being laid. And she's like, and I don't want this to be a sex podcast anymore.
Whoa.
I want this to be a podcast about women and talking about women and just being a woman and talking about women's issues and empowering women and just having a fun time, being goofy and all this stuff.
Wow.
And it was like,
That's awesome.
The turning point.
I know. It's such a dramatic turning point. And I felt like that context was almost so necessary to understand what Call Her Daddy is. Call Her Daddy is kind of someone's development out of youth. Alex Cooper was like 23 when she started this. She just turned 30. Like, just released an episode on aging, which, okay, kind of good, kind of like helpful, you know, but also in some ways it was an episode on aging, but also interviewed like celebrities about aging. And it was kind of painful to hear Alex talk sometimes. She's like, yeah, we're getting older, and that's okay. I used to think 30 was so old. And I'm like, are you serious right now?
Some people do think 30's old.
Some people do think 30's old.
Crazy.
It is.
Alex being like, I've learned so much about life. And I'm like, come on, you're 30. Let's get serious here. But all of that, all these new episodes, you know, the most recent one with Anna Kendrick, you know, talking to some lady who was in a cult. All of this is just like kind of we made this thing really popular, and I don't want that anymore. I don't want to just be someone who has to like collect sex stories online.
I feel like you're not giving her credit for the idea that like people might get bored of a sex podcast over a number of years. But if you just make it kind of about anything within the vein of women's issues, one, it keeps you interested, but also gives you infinite episode possibilities.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I think you're right. I think it was a good personal move for her. And I also think it's a savvy business move.
Mm-hmm.
I think this podcast, more than other podcasts I've listened to, I am kind of keenly aware that I am being given a product, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you watch those late night interviews and they're like chatting and you're like, oh, this is so nice. And then they just happen to be like, oh, and I'm on tour. Oh, and I am doing book, right? I feel pretty aware of that when I listen to some of these episodes. I'm like, okay, yeah, you're here to promote a thing. And Alex is trying to capitalize off of the fact that you're popular, you know? So sometimes she's going to ask you really uncomfortable questions, you know? So it's a little weird in that way, but I think it's good to point out that it is a savvy business move. And I think that's led to the longevity that she has and immense popularity.
Yeah.
So that's my dive into Call Her Daddy, an immensely popular podcast that I have to say isn't for me.
I think we could have all said that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't particularly like Alex Cooper. She says the F-bomb in like between every other word in a way that I find annoying. She drops the B-bomb, you know, poo everywhere. So it's I don't think the host is that interesting. I don't find the guests that interesting. They're not the people that I really care about. They had a comedian on who was really funny. I'm like, I think I might go listen to her podcast. I appreciated learning about the vice president. But after that, so many of the like, and this episode featuring this person, I'm like, I have no idea who that is.
Mm-hmm.
For the record, Sam is also critically detached from popular culture.
This is true.
Not that it's a bad thing, but just for scale.
There were no
That is fair.
dad musicians on there.
No dad rock and no gamers?
No gamers as far as I could tell.
No gamers. We're going to lose all our audience.
So
What's the rating?
The rating is a 3 for me. It's
Okay.
not an amazing podcast.
It's higher than the middle line.
It's true. It is technically a fine podcast. She's made something fine here. But to me, it just wasn't enjoyable. It doesn't have that much to sink your teeth into. However, if you could ace the Jeopardy category of women on TikTok, I think you would like this podcast.
Nice.
Speaking of women on TikTok, Honor, what's your podcast?
Huh? That has nothing to do with me. My podcast is one that I got off of the Spotify recommended for you homepage.
Interesting.
So this was a podcast that I purely picked based on the cover art.
That's how I found The Lonely Island in Seth Meyers' podcast, which
Whoa.
Sam then found because I told him to listen to it.
It's true.
Whoa.
Cover art's
Sam
important.
lied. Many of Sam's things I have told him about.
You want to try that again?
No.
Okay.
Cool.
Awesome. Yeah, I like a little mystery. I like a little surprise. So I was like, hey, let's just see what Spotify has for me. And I picked a podcast, and it had a nice little art of like a kind of spooky looking forest with, it's got this thing in the ground that kind of looks like maybe a sword or something, but it's kind of bent and it's got fireflies.
Ooh.
And it's called Where the Stars Fell. So I was like, okay, I'm expecting some kind of like fantasy thing, probably high fantasy, some kind of adventure. So that's it. Going in so blind. I'm not used to that. Normally I kind of know. I'm like, someone's recommended this podcast to me. I've got a reason to check it out. So this podcast is not high fantasy at all.
Whoa.
No dragons on shrooms.
Nope.
Did the Spotify recommendation algorithm?
Mm-hmm.
There's like hardly any podcast recommendation algorithm out there at all.
Yeah.
And the one place that has it, not an honor podcast. Well, I mean,
Not this one.
Was it
Not this
potentially
single selection.
Was it low fantasy?
Unclear.
Medium fantasy?
We'll come back to that about how it's unclear. So this podcast starts and I listen to the first season. Okay. We start and we follow Ed. I don't remember her last name, but her name is Ed. She's a scientist and she's coming to Jerusalem, Oregon.
This is an audio drama. This
is
not a
an
real
audio
person.
drama.
Okay.
Ah.
If in doubt, I will always say if it's not an audio drama. That's the default for me, okay?
That's crazy.
Audio drama.
I can't do them. I can't.
Really?
No.
That's wild. I, most of the time, don't have any interest in listening to something that's not an audio drama.
I'd rather watch a TV
Or actual
show.
play. But I love a pod. I love an audio drama. I get that it's not for everyone, because also it's hard to find good ones. This one starts, we follow Ed. She is going to Jerusalem, Oregon to do field research on an unclear subject matter. It's pretty vague. She's sort of generally going to study the local wildlife, is kind of all we really get. Because then her car breaks down, she ends up getting a tow from these people. It's a tiny little town, so it's all these people that are very helpful because there's no one else to help for miles around. And she pretty immediately is like, oh yeah, I'm here to like study animals or whatever, and people are like, oh, so you're one of the monster hunters. And she's like, no, I'm not like a Bigfoot hunter or anything. I'm doing science. I have a doctorate. She has 4 doctorates.
Whoa.
Yeah.
She must know lots of things.
That's like
Wow.
15 years at least.
It's a
I
lot.
don't know. I didn't do the math.
But yeah, she comes into this little town. She goes to the place where she's staying, which isn't a hotel or anything. She's rented a room with just like a resident of the town. This resident is an author named Lucille. She gets called Lucy, particularly by Ed. Ed's full name is Edison, by the way. It's Edison and Lucille. Well, Ed wants to go by Ed, but Lucille calls her Edison. Lucille wants to go by Lucille, but Ed calls her Lucy. This is kind of just the dynamic.
I see. One of them is formal, one of them is not.
Yes. So, Lucille is actually a famous high fantasy author, has a very famous book series that is immensely popular. She's very successful off that. But she lives in this tiny little town. She doesn't really go to interviews or book talks or anything. She's kind of a hermit, but she's rented out a room in her house for this scientist to stay. Ed shows up, and they kind of are at each other's throats immediately. They hate each other so much because they have very opposite personalities. It is to the extent that it was so fast and so extreme that I was like, what? You guys don't even have a reason to hate each other this much. But it just is immediate, like, fighting, arguing.
Fascinating.
Yeah. It is kind of wild, the extent to which they immediately, are just at each other's throats. But they're going to have to live with each other because Ed is coming here to study the surrounding area for several months. And it's like, okay, guess you're going to live here. Yes, Jenny.
I was gonna say, can I make a prediction? What happens?
Yeah.
This really just feels like the setup for a romance.
Oh, you're so right.
That is kind of the energy.
Because it just seems like the classic enemies to lover, like
yes.
Yeah.
one bed, like all of these classic tropes, and like it's not one bed, but it's like one house.
I think
you
it's
know?
awesome. Like, hey, I'm renting out a room in my house, and also there's only one bed. Like, it's also my bed. Like, you can have the study. There is nowhere to sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It does
yeah.
have that vibe. So I'm glad you pointed it out, because I am famously a romance hater, to an extent that other people watching or consuming media with me will be like, what if you weren't so grumpy?
By contrast, I'm a rom-connoisseur.
Okay, this is good, because I didn't really want to comment on it because they haven't made any extreme moves yet, but it is set up to be the enemies to lovers thing, but I feel like it's set up poorly.
Oh, it can be sloppy as heck, you know?
Yeah.
I feel like I can hear the sloppiness coming through,
Yeah.
especially because they already hate each other so much. Like, it's like,
Yes, dude.
you're just trying to get to this point where it can be a trope,
Yeah. And
which
it
can
is-
then be the trope.
Yeah.
It's like eventually, okay, yeah, they've actually said things about each other that then they have actual arguments about. Like, there's an insult Ed throws out that she doesn't think through because she doesn't think through most things she says, and Lucille really takes offense to it. Like, for the next couple days, is still taking offense. And it is because Lucille has... They might not even necessarily say what the disability is, but she has a bad leg and so uses a cane a lot of the time. And it hit a nerve there, and they actually had to have a conversation about it. It's like, okay, that's an actual point of, like, you guys actually having something to argue about. To get there, though, like, the first shot that's thrown, that's personal, there's no reason for them to have gotten personal.
It's also
They
really,
barely know each other.
yeah, it's really strange because they're like, I guess they have to live together. I think you can just go be somewhere else. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to rent your
I
room
mean,
to
it's
this
a
person.
small town.
Yeah, the idea is it's a tiny little town.
But if I was Lucille, I'd be like, get out of my house.
Yeah. I think she's renting a room because she's been in a rut writing for a little bit, so
Mhm.
she's a little tight on cash.
Sure.
That is why she's doing it.
The writers, the money comes in spurts.
And Ed isn't staying in, because I'm sure there's a hotel or something, but she's not
Yeah.
staying there because she's having to do, she has a lot of scientific equipment with her and needs
Mhm.
somewhere to set it up.
When I imagine she doesn't have necessarily the money to do a hotel all the time, like, you know, those
Yeah,
Airbnbs,
like a 3-month stay.
Airbnbs, you know, it's, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a little cheaper.
Yep. So I'll hit a little bit on what happens each episode because I also think it's useful to see how that goes. Episode 2,
This was all episode 1?
this is all episode 1. These are fairly short episodes,
How
by the
long?
way. They're about 25 minutes, which includes a couple minutes of ads and a couple minutes of credits. So it's not long at all.
May I ask, is it in progress or completed?
I believe it's completed.
Okay.
It looks like there's 3 seasons, with the third being slightly longer. It doesn't say finale on it, but
Mhm.
the last 2 episodes that are out are a part 1 and part 2. That's normally a finale.
Mm-hmm.
So, episode 2, Ed is out on the field doing, field science stuff. And she's always, when she's doing the field research, she has a recorder on her. So that's a lot of the context of the podcast, is her speaking into her recorder. And there's a lot of frogs. That's how it starts, is there's a bunch of frogs. And then there's even more frogs. There's even more frogs, and it is a plague of frogs.
That's just like that one time.
Yeah.
The Bible?
Yep.
Oh,
And
no,
they
not
go-
what I was thinking about at all. There's a plague of frogs in the Bible?
Yes.
Yes.
What? I thought they were just locusts everywhere.
It's frogs.
There's many plagues, and one of them is frogs.
I think it's locusts then frogs.
Really? Because the frogs eat the locusts.
I believe so.
It's like economics, Sam. Supply meets demand.
Sam is so excited.
I love economics.
He does.
Wow.
But yeah,
Wow.
there's a plague of frogs, and they do go, like in the Bible, they get a lamb from one of the local farms, and they take it out to a field, because Ed's like, we need blood to put over people's doors.
What?
Yes, Ed slaughters this lamb. Lucille is like, so, because she's such a proper English woman. By the way, Ed is American, Lucille is British.
Are they
It
in
is super
England?
apparent. I don't
No, they're in
think
Oregon.
so. No, they're in Oregon, yeah.
I will say I do like that because a freaking problem for me with audio formats is that I can't tell who is who.
It is very helpful for that. But Lucille is, like, in the truck several,
Ooh.
like, 50 feet away from Ed in this field where she's slaughtering a lamb and using a bucket to collect the blood.
What?
And Lucille
What?
is, like, about to vomit because she's too uppity for this. And then they go and they put a little bit of blood over everyone's doors, and then the frogs go away. And they're like,
What?
okay, time to wash it off. And that's just kind of the episode.
This is episode 2?
This is episode 2.
A lot's happening
This
fast.
just happens, and they're like, okay, so the blood thing worked. Time to go wash off all the blood off everyone's doorways because we don't need to leave that there. Episode end.
Fascinating.
There's no explanation.
What the hell?
There's no even... The next episode, they don't even try to figure out why did that happen. It's on to the next thing.
I feel like this is a very impulsive writer, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, they
it's
just want them
interesting.
to be in conflict, so they're, like, immediately at each other's throats. There's a swarm of frogs, and they're like, oh, yeah, well, that's over now.
Yep.
It's just interesting. I'm with you on the pacing. I see why you're doing
Yeah.
the episode by episode.
Yeah.
It's jarring.
The pacing is bizarre. Episode 3, Ed is approached by one of the farmers who's like, there's something crazy that's killing a bunch of my livestock. Something huge. Basically, don't need to go into a ton of detail for this one. Ed is looking into it, and at a point finds the beast and is attacked by it.
El Chupacabra.
I was just about to say it's the chupacabra.
Maybe.
Is it the chupacabra? What is it?
Chupacabra.
She's attacked by this beast. She
The Chupacabra.
like is startled, but it like gets chased off and runs away. But then Ed is found by Lucille and the farmer, and she's like, "Oh, I'm fine," but like throws up from shock. Which also, there's throwing up sound effects on this podcast. Never good.
Not for me.
Never good.
No, thank you.
Please don't put. If
I
you're
feel
gonna
like-
have someone throw up, do like retching noises. You don't need to put the liquid sounds. It's
Oh.
bad.
Oh,
Yeah,
both. I
it's-
thought it was just their. Oh
No.
no.
No, if it was just
I
like,
think-
bleh, like
Can I be
whatever.
honest? That needs a trigger warning.
Yes.
That does need a trigger warning.
Which they might have had in the description, to be fair, but
I feel like you can't have written trigger warnings. No one reads the description. Everyone reads the description. People love and appreciate all effort done by podcasters near and far.
Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah.
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 But
It's so hard not to touch.
she
the
just
mic.
gets up and walks away. She ends up fainting, but it's because of she throws up and kind of faints, but it's pretty clearly because of shock. Not that anything has happened to her. And it's just kind of like, what happened? You were just attacked by a beast and now it's just kind of gone and also you're fine? Okay, she gets taken away. It's like Lucille's like, I'll drive you home. You're not in a state to drive yourself. Next episode, they don't talk about that either.
What?
What? Nope. Nothing. Yeah, the next episode, semi-related potentially. Ed discovers this chopped off, torn off a limb of a giant animal.
El Chupacabra.
She describes it as it looks kind of like the leg of a big cat, and the like big paw pad where the palm would be is the size of her whole hand.
Chupacabra.
And she ends up taking it inside to study it because she studies things. She's a scientist. And it has a dew claw.
For the non-animal listeners, not
Yes.
animal, but like, you know, what is a dew claw?
Dew claw is kind of...
Oh, it's the cat thumb?
Yeah. It's
Okay.
technically not a thumb, but it's what most people think of when they think of the cat
Yeah.
thumb. It's kind of
Yeah.
on the back of their paw.
Yeah.
Um,
The
Cat
thumb.
thumb.
Cat thumb.
cat thumb.
Yeah.
But she ends up... She's like, okay, I want to see this claw. Push on the tendon for it to extend.
Good
And
job, Jenny. I couldn't think of it either.
and it hooks out and somehow like pierces her arm, like she's clawed, she's hooked,
Ow.
she's stuck. And she also starts freaking out and talking in a way that it seems like the tone is that it's supposed to be kind of mysterious, but she's very clearly talking about the fact that she has supernatural healing powers and they're not working right now. So that just kind of happens. She's like, okay, that's weird. She also has a very extreme reaction, which is fair because she has a giant claw in her arm, but also it is interesting that she has this reaction because she doesn't really know what pain is like extreme pain, because she talks about having superhuman healing powers.
Fascinating.
So she ends up calling Lucille in to help her get this claw out of her arm, and then goes to the hospital. And they're like, okay, yeah, claw wound, go back home. And they go home. This is the first time that, okay, this is still real in the next episode. She has an arm bandage and like her arm is kind of out of commission because there was a giant claw in it. But the next episode, they go to a school presentation where they talk about their jobs as a field researcher and an author. And it just feels so random to be like, yeah, they're gonna go talk to a high school. And there's kind of a subplot thrown in where Lucille kind of talks about being so awkward, and because she doesn't normally go do book talks or anything. So she only does this because Ed kind of bullies her into doing it. Not bullies her, but she starts poking fun at her, and then Lucille's like, I'm gonna do this to spite you. But it's like, why? Don't do that.
I don't know. I get the spite doing.
Yeah. So Ed goes up and does a talk and makes such a glancing remark about the fact that her arm got clawed by a monster. She just says the word monster, and then all these high school kids that did not care before, because why would they care, start just bombarding her with questions about monsters, just in a way that is not how no one would care. No one would care, but it becomes this huge thing where everyone's like, you didn't think that through. And it's like, what? So that doesn't make sense. And then Lucille goes up and gives an objectively fine little speech. Like, it's boring, sure, which also these whole speeches play out, and they're not interesting to listen to.
And that's like kind of the point? Like, it's
kind
like
of
the point.
It's kind of the whole podcast episode, but it's like just not interesting to listen to. You could have done a snippet. But then she has this interaction with Ed afterward, where she's like, I'm always really anxious about all of these things because I'm autistic. And Ed's like, okay, but it went fine. Which, I get the plot, but also that is how I felt. Was like, okay, it's fine. And several times through this podcast, there's points where, like, with Lucille's leg and her cane use, she brings up autism. Ed brings up ADHD at some point. There are these points where it feels like forced diversity and representation in ways that I want to choose my words carefully to talk about, because I care about representation and diversity in media a lot. It's one of the things I care about very, very passionately. But it is just thrown in there in ways that don't feel that related to the main plot or anything, in a way that could come across as just wanting brownie points, which I could see as being a reality. I could also see it being a reality where these creators have relationships to these things and these experiences, and so are putting them in for that representation for themselves, which is a good thing, but doesn't mean it was done tastefully either. So it's hard and weird to talk about, because I'm like, I think these were done with good intentions, and if nothing else, I think they were done for the creators, and I'm happy for them to have that. But they are really random, and because of that, it makes them feel unfulfilling and feels like it does a disservice to those things and those aspects. Yeah. So that's a weird part of it, and feels like kind of what this whole episode was set up for, even though it doesn't do anything for the overall plot, really, except maybe a little bit for the relationship between Ed and Lucille. But it feels like it did not need a whole episode.
Yeah. I also think inclusion in media is important, but I think the exact right word is disservice, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have a good story, and you're like, but I want to include these things, it doesn't matter. Like, sure, that's there, but like, who cares? You didn't do anything with it. You didn't, and then like here's this, person, here's this community. You didn't bring anything out. You didn't communicate anything to the audience other than, hey, you heard about this one? You know,
Yeah.
it doesn't do anything.
It does just come
Yeah.
across as vying for brownie points and or shallow.
And it's also kind of hard because sometimes, like, you can have representation, but it's not a story about representation, so it can be important in those ways. But I can see
Yeah.
how you mean
Yeah.
that, like, this isn't done well. And also, like, you can separate the, like, concept of, like, representation being important from the fact of, like, this is not a good example
Right.
of what
Yeah.
representation looks like.
It-
But just kind of, like, I just was, like, pushing back a little bit on
Mhm.
what you're saying. I think it's fair, but also, like, not every story, like, people who have, like, any sort of, like, kind of thing going on, like, if someone has autism, not every story about them is necessarily about
Right.
that. Like,
That's-
they can have other
yeah.
stories and that's just, like, a part of them. But, like,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah,
It
which if
doesn't-
anything, it feels like a disservice
Yeah.
in this specific instance because it is like she didn't actually have really a struggle about it. So it just felt like a very shallow way of
It feels
portraying
inauthentic.
Yes.
I mean,
It
you're like,
feels
what do
like
you
a
actually-
disservice to her and that representation.
I was also just kind of saying is, like, not everything is about that. Like, you can have that and also have other things going on. So I kind of, like, it doesn't
Yeah.
always have to be, like, a huge plot line.
I
But it does
Yeah.
feel odd the way that they seem to be kind of handling it clunky.
right. Well, because it also doesn't sound like I'm imagining, because I've listened to stories like this
Mhm.
where it's like, you know, this person is, you know, it feels like this character attribute is put there just to be inclusive, and it doesn't do anything otherwise. Like, I'm imagining Lucille to say like, I'm autistic, but like not like the actor not act that way at all, like not
Yeah.
have anything. And then you're like, are we representing anything here? Are you does that
Yeah.
do any good for anyone if it feels really hollow and inauthentic?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, who are you? You know what I mean? Because it's not
Yeah.
true representation.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it feels like brownie points. It feels like it does more of a disservice than anything, which is unfortunate, and I wish wasn't the case. But that's all of episode 6, which again is a weird pacing thing that gets a whole episode, but also there was an entire episode for the Plague of Frogs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The pacing is weird.
Yeah.
I wonder more about kind of like these the author of, I don't know how many people wrote it or their background.
I think there were 2.
because it
I'm not
just
certain.
it seems odd, like it seems maybe like this is a really early on project. Like everything's
Yeah.
done a little clunky and maybe a little
Yeah.
messy.
Which, to talk about the production a little bit, I didn't do a ton of research. I'm a bad podcaster. But it is put on by Caldera Studios, is the name, I believe. It's the same studio that is in association with Midnight Burger, which we have talked about.
Sam likes that
Yeah.
one.
Yay!
It has a lot of the same charm that Midnight Burger had, of these charming characters. There's a lot of banter, clearly, if you have 2 characters that hate each other. A lot of banter, and it is funny. But I think also in Midnight Burger, we said the thing about it sounds like the author was never allowed to write an F-bomb before.
Oh, yes.
It's even worse in this.
Interesting.
Just like way worse. And one thing I will say is that in the credits they say they have like a sensitivity reader, which is good and is a sign that, because at first I was like, I think they're just going for brownie points.
Mhm.
But shows that there's probably more nuance in the behind the scenes
Mhm.
there. I think it was probably with good intentions. I think it was just poorly executed, which is deeply unfortunate. But
Yeah.
Is that the whole first season?
no, there's 2 more episodes.
Okay.
I actually noted for episode 7, which is the one we're on now, that was when I noticed in the credits that they credited a sensitivity reader, because in episode 7, Lucille is talking, she gets off the phone at the start of the episode with her agent, who they've been talking with the editor, had some notes about a fantasy drug that she put in her book that she's working on, about it not being realistic enough. And I'm with Lucille, by the way, in that she's like, it's a magical society. Who cares? It's a magic fake drug that doesn't exist. But they're like, it's not realistic enough and people will nitpick. Which is also true.
Putting the high in high fantasy.
Yep.
I also want to update on the fact that we're doing a floor pod today. That
Yeah.
my foot has fallen asleep.
That's
because it's
awesome.
at a weird angle.
That's
See,
awesome.
that's what happens to me at your tall people angles.
I was about to say, that's what happens to me when I'm sitting up in chairs that are
Yeah.
too tall. My whole leg falls asleep.
My bottom falls asleep.
But yeah, this episode, she's like, okay, I guess I need to have more realistic information on drugs. You know who I could ask, but I hate to ask? My housemate that has a doctorate in chemistry.
Bum, bum,
So she asks
bum.
Ed, and Ed gets really excited because she's been asked to give information on science, which she loves. Yes.
I say that is really accurate. If you know anyone into chemistry, they love to tell you about chemistry more than other science.
Yeah.
I know 2 people who like chemistry. Charlotte and Lily, this is for you. You guys love to talk about chemistry.
Yeah, which is fair. But she gets so excited, she goes, yes, you asked me right now, and in 20 minutes I will have a demonstration. Lucille's like, what does that mean?
Are you drugs?
Yes, literally the ending line for the scene goes, is she going to take all of them? And then they go to the next scene.
Awesome.
Which I think is the funniest line they had. She ends up doing this demonstration. They talk a lot about science-y things, but it gives the vibe that it's kind of halfway made up science, but they want to talk about it long enough that it feels realistic, and they're trying to avoid the thing that Lucille talks about, which is readers or listeners here being nitpicky because it's not accurate enough. I'm like, guys, it's okay. You don't need Ed to explain to me why this specimen that she finds fascinating is fascinating. She could just be fascinated by it, and I'll be interested. Yeah. I'm excited for her to be excited. They have this demonstration. Ed accidentally takes drugs, then more drugs than she meant to. And she's like, I'm about to start tripping. And she ends up going into this whole tangent about the fact that she is functionally illiterate and managed to get 4 doctorates anyway. And it's part of the arc of, this is when part of actual arguments that happen between her and Lucille, because Lucille treats her like an idiot all the time. And Ed's like, I'm not an idiot. People have treated me like idiots for forever, but I'm not. So cut it out. I'm mad. But she finishes going into her backstory on this and talking about her childhood, which hasn't happened at all up until this point. And Lucille goes, okay, so if I ever need a truth serum, I'm going to put you on drugs. And then, end of episode.
What?
Last episode of the season. Sam, get ready to bleep because I wrote this so many times, but one of my notes is, please use a word other than f***.
That's pretty awesome.
Guess what? Ed's out in the field again, doing more field research.
Killing more goats? Sheep? Lambs.
It was a lamb.
Lamb.
Yeah.
I like to pronounce the B in lamb, as I do with Samba.
Lamb.
There's a secret
Yep.
B.
They can't know about the secret B, Jenny. Don't tell them.
Yeah. She ends up finding what appears to be the type of beast whose leg she found before, which she keeps describing as a lion, but gigantic. She ends up kind of circling it. She also finds, this is when I go back. This episode starts with her finding a crater where you go, right, I forgot this podcast was called Where the Stars Fell. She's like, what is this crater thing? Is it radioactive? It feels weird on my hands. It's affecting my super abilities to heal. What's happening? It's like, clearly that's a star. Okay, we're finally getting to the name of the podcast. Episode 8, we're getting to it a little bit. Ed ends up confronting this lion thing. She's scared. Lucille ends up showing up. They're both in this crater thing. The lion's about to jump in, and Lucille goes, hold on, and she takes off her shirt because she has wings.
What?
She has wings, and she
What?
picks Ed up and
Dude.
flies them out of there. And Ed's like, so, like, are we gonna talk about this? And Lucille's like, no, because there's also been this thread throughout the whole thing, which Ed is now mad about these weird, unnatural things happening to Ed. But Lucille is like, no, is normal. There's no real evidence of the supernatural. But Ed is like, you were walking evidence, and you keep being weird about this. And crazy, horrible, like, awful things keep happening. And Lucille's like, it's fine. Which also directly contradicts the way she acted about a lot of lamb blood. Because she was really squeamish about that. But now, everything's fine and normal. I don't know how I skimmed over this. There's an episode where Ed is asked to build like a loft for someone in the town for their quote-unquote daughter. They end up finding out the daughter is a giant cocoon.
Been there.
And yeah. And the person starts, like, turns into some kind of monster thing, but Lucille shows up out of the blue and kind of saves the day, and then Ed's like, what was that? And Lucille's like, yeah, that was some weird papier-mâché kind of abstract sculpture. I don't know. That was weird, but actually it was normal. And Ed's like, you've had wings this whole time, but you keep acting like everything is normal, and I take offense to that. And Lucille's like, well, yeah, it's been difficult hiding it in this small town. There's a lot of weird things that happen in Jerusalem, Oregon. There's also been very offhand mentions of angels throughout the season, and now there's a person with wings, and she directly mentions in that moment that they're in a town called Jerusalem. And you're like, okay, a lot of Bible references showing up. And then there's a weird distorted voice that shows up, and I don't even remember what it says. It's just like, I have a message for you or something. And then Ed faints, and it goes, I forgot they do that. Season end.
Hey, Honor, can I rate your podcast for you?
Yeah.
Sounds bad.
Yeah, I have one more detail before I give my rating, which is that I looked at the About page for this podcast on Spotify, right? I was about 5 episodes in or something. I'm reading through it. I scrolled down, and in part of the just synopsis description, like where there's hypothetically no spoilers, it says, Ed is the Antichrist. What? And Lucille is her guardian angel. They don't know that yet. Tune in.
Major spoiler alert.
Okay, all right.
They don't mention that at all. They don't get to that at all in the first season. Like, for the most part, you're kind of like, is there something supernatural going on for the first, like, several episodes? Because they don't ever connect anything to one another, or it's so bizarre. The pacing is so weird and off.
This sounds like a really bad podcast, but this revelation I think is actually really awesome. One, it explains why you would listen to this podcast.
Yeah.
Because I can't imagine listening to this and be like, I really want to stick with this for more than an episode. Or two, I also really like that the Antichrist has ADHD.
Yeah.
That is funny to me.
Makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And that, what is an angel's day job but like a Tolkien emulator?
Yes, dude. Yeah. And they are kind of fun characters. Like I said, it's a little bit, not a little bit, it's kind of forced how they hate each other so bad. But also, I don't know, sometimes that just happens.
Though it might have been their internal angel and Antichrist.
That is kind of the thing that once I read that, I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. You gotta bring that up at some point in the first season. Because right now, I just think your characters hate each other for no reason, except for that you're clearly setting up an enemies to lovers thing, which there's a couple more moments throughout this season where it's like, okay, yeah, that's what they're doing. I rate this podcast a 2.
Out of 5?
Out of 5.
Not a good pod.
That's
Antichrist
40%.
and Guardian Angels. I also weirdly think I just really felt the need to lay out episode by episode, which isn't a thing I normally feel the need to do because of the pacing being so weird, which means I talked about this podcast for like maybe longer than an episode even is.
Certainly you did.
Yeah.
Certainly you did. But sometimes you got to get that bile out of your system for a really bad podcast. You know? Sometimes you just got to, just spit some bile.
Yeah.
Speaking of spitting bile, Jenny, what podcast did you listen to?
See, I feel like there was almost a more seamless transition. Because, speaking of a scientist and a writer, together, combined, Yeah, Sam. I'm out hosting you on your own podcast.
Genny's replacing you.
Slowly. But
Your podcast is
Dear Hank and John, starring Hank Green and John Green, the brothers Green, if you will. Now, I'm going to take you on a little bit more of a story than maybe traditionally happens. And it's also going to be meandering because I didn't write notes like I intended to.
Yay.
I was not a podcast person. I tended to get really confused because I didn't know who was talking. I also tended to get really bored. I didn't know like how to listen to them.
Yeah.
I was just not meant for it. It also used to be a thing like in the car when I was little. I could not do talk radio, which sucked for my mom, who is obsessed with NPR. She loves it. Loves it
that woman.
so much. But if there was not music on, I felt like my skin was crawling.
Oh my God.
Or like, I don't know, it would just be weird. Like I would just like if my sister one time was like, we're gonna have silent car time, and I was like dying. Like I was just like twitching in the back seat, like, and then I just started like singing quietly to myself because I couldn't take the quiet. Anyway, I was not built for talk. I was not built for quiet. But as I got a little bit older, I started getting, I did a reading phase, pretty hard reading stint in middle school.
Very good.
Got really into the YA. Started with a dystopian, and then at some point I found John Green because I was like, everyone was like, this is the YA. Actually, I think it was because I saw The Fault in Our Stars with my mom, and I was like, okay.
Yes. John Green, author, most famous for YA novel, Fault in Our Stars.
The only novel of his I haven't read
Whoa.
because I saw the movie, and I just have a hard time getting through things when I've like know what happens.
Interesting.
So I haven't read that book, but I've read all of his other books. In almost all, I have not finished The Anthropocene Reviewed, but everything else I've read.
Which is the only book of his I have read.
I've read at least 3/4 of it.
Yeah.
But I just never finished it. And then my friend, my lovely Charlotte, who was also in chemistry, loves chemistry, also a listener to the podcast. Charlotte's awesome.
Oh.
Much love to Charlotte.
Shout outs.
And so we talked about it a lot. And then her sister was a lot deeper into all this than I was. Like, she was also a big John Green fan and knew a little bit more about like their online personalities. And now I also kind of, but didn't fully put it together, that John Green was also the crash course guy. So like in middle school social studies, when they didn't want to deal with us, pull up one of those videos.
Yep.
And so I kind of knew it was the same person, but it wasn't like cemented. So anyway, we find out he's going on a book tour for his newest book, Turtles All the Way Down. I was freaking jazzed. I was amped. And he was going to stop in St. Louis it was some like Catholic boys' school in an auditorium there.
Nice.
So we bought tickets. I think it was like $25 each.
Whoa.
You know what came with that ticket? 1, admission. 2, a tote bag. 3, a signed copy, though I had already purchased online another signed copy, so it was a little silly. So I have 2 signed copies of that book.
Nice.
A poster, and the best night of my life. It was awesome. If you ever have the chance to go to a John and or Hank Green book tour, do it. It's awesome. It's like 2 hours. It's a multimedia experience. There are sing-alongs. There are presentations. There are them. And there is, at the end, which I didn't understand the first time I was there, a live recording of the podcast Dear Hank and John.
Right.
At the time, I was like, why are they doing a weird talk show in the middle of this awesome day? Also, it was still funny, but there was like this weird format where it's the 2 of them on stage. They're answering audience questions that we had written in. And then at the end, this critical bit at what they shared all the news from both Mars and AFC Wimbledon, a 3rd-tier English soccer club. And I was like, this is so weird. And also, everyone seems like they know what's going on.
Also, just to recap in case anyone doesn't know, Hank Green is John Green's brother, also does Crash Course. They have like a media company together.
Yes.
They do fun videos together.
Mm-hmm. And are pretty popular on TikTok and, well, recently for the youths. For the olds, you get the Crash Course, the YouTube. They are like internet papas. Mm-hmm. They have been there for a long time. They have done almost anything you can think of on the internet. They got in early and they're doing good work. Also like great charity impacts, all this other stuff.
Yeah.
And they're just kind of everywhere. Though also at this time, I think they were known by the internet people, but they were, I'd say, much less known by the public.
Sure.
Not that I was super early because I was after the Fault in Our Stars movie. But I was right at that, like, I was coming in with everyone when then they bullied John Green off of Tumblr,
Yep.
really hard, and then
I don't
there
know
was
how to
pivot.
this.
That
and then
happened.
they kind of like fell back out of the public eye, and they've just been off on the internet, and then they kind of gone back in with TikTok and all this other stuff. But I was kind of in this kind of crucial part of in between waves of fame and stardom. And anyway, so I was like, what's this weird talk show? Also, though, like back to the book tour, Hank Green in a turtle costume giving a lecture on the difference between phylogeny and taxonomy. Awesome.
Whoa.
Yeah. Also sang a bunch of different songs, like Hank Green's song about an anglerfish, because he has a band and did music, and
Sure.
it's interesting.
That's right.
I like it. Nerd
No,
rock.
I like nerd rock. He does a good
Yeah.
nerd rock.
Yeah,
I can only imagine the book tour was amazing.
it was awesome.
But I'm sure that, you go to one, book tour event, you can never go back.
Oh, but you can.
What?
Great transition, Samuel. So then, later, Hank Green tries his hand at writing. He comes out with the book, An Absolutely Remarkable Thing. Or is it? No, yeah. I always mix it up with the sequel, An Absolutely Foolish Endeavor. Or a Remarkably Foolish Endeavor?
Superb endeavor?
It's Foolish Endeavor.
You're foolish.
I'm fool. Anyway, so then I went when we were like, the last one was so awesome. We have to go again.
Yeah.
And so we go, and it's so fun. Same thing. There's songs, there's dancing. There's John Green in a Bumblebee costume giving a lecture about, I think, or maybe just a talk about Bumblebee from Transformers.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, very awesome. Really great. They do readings from the book, and then, again, it kind of middle/ends with this talk show. And I'm like, interesting. Is this like a tour thing? I also had noticed almost everyone in the audience, this time a church in like downtownish Kansas City. And everyone had these name tags that says, hello, my name is Ryan. So confused. Still only mildly know what that means. But anyway.
It's the best kind of inside joke.
Yeah. I'm like peripheral to it. Like I know it was like This Week in Ryan's was like a spin-off podcast they have on their Patreon. And they became This Week in Stuff. So then went to the book tour. It was awesome. Ended with this talk show. And it's that when I realized it is a podcast. And they're doing a live recording. And I was like, interesting. Maybe I should check it out. Because I sure like what's going on here. I tried. I failed. Did not like it. I can't do podcasts. At least at this point, could not do podcasts.
Uh-huh.
And then we get to the final installment of this story. We've come to the pandemic. I got sad.
Aw.
And
That
my
happens.
mom got us a dog.
Nice.
He is a little geriatric weirdo,
And his name is
Mr. Pickles.
God bless him.
Wow.
And he has no teeth and a bunch of problems, but he's a fighter, and he's like, I don't know, 8. He was 8 at the time. Now he's like 10 or 12 or something. But I was on online school. I had this dog. Dog needed to pee, especially because he's old and tiny. So I would take him on a lot of walks. And I was walking, getting outside, trying to be less sad. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to check out this podcast because I really enjoyed it live. So then I started listening to it, and I got really into it.
Yeah.
It is fun. It's great. It's a romp. It's so fun. It'll make you laugh. It won't make you cry, but it'll make you laugh. And
good.
so the podcast works where the two brothers, Hank and John Green, people write in, they answer their questions from the listeners. They give them quote unquote dubious advice.
This is true.
It is their mark of the podcast. The advice must be dubious and dubious only. And then at the end, they both report on 2 things they find really interesting. Hank Green talks about all the week's news from Mars because he finds it interesting. Also, Mars, the planet in the sky. And then John Green reports on the week's news from ASC Wimbledon, a struggling English football or soccer club, if you will,
That's
which
awesome.
they part own and is like has become a big thing.
Yeah.
And this also, a little bit of a tangent, the fandom itself is called Nerdfighteria. And that is all of the people who are involved with kind of their YouTube, their podcast, like all this stuff is in their dome of it's their daddy gang is Nerdfighteria.
Nice.
Yeah, and you're a nerd fighter, not a daddy ganger. Yeah, so that's a critical difference between Call Her Daddy and Dear Hank and John. Yeah.
Daddy Ganger sounds like a disease you'd get in the Civil War.
Oh my gosh, it
Yeah.
does.
Rickets and Daddy Ganger. I think it's like gangrene.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like John Green or Hank
Like John
Green.
Hank.
Yeah, it's a tremendous podcast. I've listened to Dear Hank and John for a long time. Except, Jenny, you and me have worked at it from opposite angles.
Opposite directions, some might
You
even
started
say.
at the most recent point and listened to stuff as it's come out.
Yes, and a little bit backwards.
I started at the very beginning. This was like my second ever podcast that I listened to a lot of.
Whoa.
And I started at the very beginning and then went forward. So we're almost
met in the middle.
almost overlapped. Like I
Oh,
know
like Lady and the
I know
Tramp.
the My Name is Ryan bit.
Can you Lady and the Tramp this podcast?
I think we will. We'll get that juicy meatball of episode like 150.
Nice.
Heck yeah.
Yeah. I really enjoy the podcast, and it was foundational for our relationship
Whoa.
because the first time you took me out to dinner, you were like, "Hey, you know about Dear Hank and John?" I was like, "I love that show," and you're like, "I do too."
I actually think what it was is that I think I had the tote bag, maybe.
Could be, yeah.
That I had gotten at the book tour. The book came in a nice tote
Wow.
bag. Maybe not.
That's really cute.
And I was like, "I love this," and you were like, "Yeah, me too." And I was like, "Nerd, got it.
Yeah.
Nerd achieved."
we
Love
we
it.
bonded. We
It
bonded.
was awesome.
I also flexed on Sam because I have seen them live twice.
True.
wow.
Not to brag.
Jenny, how would you rate this podcast? I know I love it, but how would you rate it?
I think it would have to be okay. I am one of those people who has a really hard time giving 5s.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, in real life
That's
I actually love to give 5s, but I feel like if I'm officially ranking things, I feel like
Whoa.
I shouldn't give a 5.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's like a 4.9. Because
Whoa.
I don't know. I just feel like it might not be for
Nice.
everyone, but I think it's good. It's
Yeah.
just nice to listen to. It'll put a smile on your face. Honestly, I kind of think it's good in volume.
Mm.
Whereas there's some podcasts you can only listen to like an episode every day or so.
Yeah.
Or like
Sure.
you can't binge it. I think it's a very bingeable podcast.
Nice.
I think it's fun. I think it's interesting. I think it's hilarious. Sometimes you'll have like a 5-year-old writing in and being like, "What is a tree?" And so then they balance each other well because Hank Green has all this science information. John Green's like angsty and a writer.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of perspectives that come into play. So they'll offer advice. They'll give you scientific explanations of things that you're curious about. If you have like a weird math problem you kind of want solved, where you're like, how many rubber ducks would it take to fill the Hudson River? Like this is the place you put it.
That's awesome.
You put it in their inbox.
That's
DearHankandJohn@gmail.com, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, yet another aspect, another layer of this podcast
Whoa.
lasagna is that it is called Dear Hank and John. But there's this running bet that in 2027,
8.
2028?
Yep.
That was 2027.
Unless they modified it. From
Okay, well, 2028 is when they return it, but if not by 2027, right? If
Don't know.
there are not people
I'm
on
lost.
the Mars, if they're not people on Mars by December 31st, 2027, they will rename the podcast to Dear John and Hank,
Whoa.
which is crazy. But also,
That
it's
is
even
wild.
crazier because I think they made that bet in like 2008, 2010,
No.
2012.
Like when they started the podcast in like 2018 or maybe 2015.
I think it was like
They didn't
2016.
give
It was at
themselves a
least
lot of time.
2016
Yeah.
because I think I saw the book tour in 2016. So I think the podcast has been around since at least 2016.
It's rapidly approaching. Hank
Yeah.
made that bet. He's like, there'll be people on Mars. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. I'll
that's-
take that.
Yeah.
Crazy.
But now we're 3 years away, and it's like there's only so
Yeah.
many years left.
I think it was like maybe after 3 months of that bet, he was like, they were like, Hank was like, I may have been too.
I don't know.
confident.
He still had some hope up
was.
until a couple years ago, and I think they might have adjusted the bet for something else, and I can't remember what. But
Interesting.
it is fun.
I do have to say, there's nothing that makes me more willing to believe your very high review than saying that you listened to it once, could not do it, and then came back. There's
Mhm.
nothing that boosts my confidence more than when someone's like, I listened to this thing, did not like it. I listened to it a second time, though. I'm like, okay, so it must be good.
Yeah, if it
I
bounces
wasn't
off
ready.
you.
Yeah, I wasn't ready to podcast yet,
Yeah,
and it wasn't its fault. It was mine.
it happens.
I love that you in this podcast had like a beautiful like Hallmark Christmas movie-esque, reuniting with your high school sweetheart.
Yeah, and I'm just saying, if you're thinking about listening to it, one time when me and my mom were driving back from upstate New York, it's about a 13-hour drive. And on this drive, we were trying to do it in one day. And there's only so much music one can play before one is tired of all of the same songs over and over again. Because 14 hours is, might I say, a long time. And so I was like, Mom, you'll love this podcast. And so I turned it on. First episode, she was like, I don't know, Jen. I think we need the music back. And I was like, just give it some time. We got to the point where we were about like 45 minutes away from home. She was cackling, crying, laughing. She said, Jen, I need you to turn it off because I can't drive. It's too funny. It's
awesome.
too dang funny. And it was
so good.
It was a particularly good episode, but she came around.
Similar-ish experience with my mom. This podcast, officially, mom approved.
Yeah.
I didn't know your mom had approved.
She approves.
I've been telling Sam he should write in about this podcast to get promotion, and he has yet to do so.
You know where you should write in? I grabbed a Segway.
I wish I could grab a Segway so I could write it like Paul Blart Mall Cop.
You know what else people approve of?
I picked up a
I
Segway
appreciate it.
and handed it to you. I
I
gave it to you.
I love it.
I
love
gave
it
it to
and I'm
you.
gonna keep it in my heart
Yeah,
forever.
cherish that.
But I gotta
Cherish that.
I know what I
Idiot.
Sam,
We're going with my Segway. I have to edit this podcast. I know the parts I want to edit out.
Guys, Sam is censoring me.
you better not cut any of my gems. I like to add B's to words with M's. What about it? I don't know why my podcast persona is so combative.
Because
good.
I know why.
I'm such a peach.
You know what else people...
Read the email.
There's an email?
You know what else people approve of? Our inbox at podpodcastcast@gmail.com, but we're not going there this week.
We aren't.
We're not going there. I'm skipping the inbox this week.
Womp womp.
I know the
Keep it
chorus of people are screaming. Everyone's crying. Everyone, tell us how dissatisfied you are with this. We'll come back to the inbox next round table. Email in. Do the usual email in. Tell us how much you hate us skipping the inbox. We'll come back to it.
Yeah.
Today, I actually wanted to read off some reviews we got on Apple Podcasts.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Take a bite out of that Apple Podcast. Do you like my folly I've been adding to this, listeners? If you do, write the pod. Tell Sam you should have me on more, because I'm a peach.
So true.
That was me taking another bite out of the apple.
Thank you, Genevieve. I pulled up our reviews. This is also a good reminder that if you want to be featured on Podpodcastcast, you can also leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you can write a little review, and I'll probably read it off eventually someday when I skip the inbox. Also, if you want to leave a review on Podcast Addict, do also email in because I won't check. All right.
Awesome.
We have 2 reviews I want to read off today. The first being titled Podpodcastcast.
Very good.
5 stars. Informational and entertaining. Love the last. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another.
Surprising to me that we're informational.
Yeah, we're informational.
We've managed it.
We're infotainment.
Yeah.
The other review is really good. 5 stars. Really good. Thank you for emailing.
Yes.
For reviewing, rather.
Yes.
We love you, listener. Email in. Write us your reviews. We'd be happy to read them out. You know what else we're happy about? Having you on, Jenny. Thank you for coming on.
You're
really
welcome.
a delight. This is
Thanks for having me.
a longer episode than usual, and we appreciate your goofs and your gaffes. And
Because it's good.
Yeah.
And you will listen to the whole thing.
I
Or
think
you
that's
won't.
important to conclude at the end. Thank you, Otter.
Yeah.
Especially because they won't hear the threat until they're either already there or already gone. That's the magic of the movies.
And you know what else is the magic of the movies? Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Honor.
Thank
Listener.
you, Sam.
Thank me. Thank you, listener. Follow us. Do all those dibbly do things. You gotta hit the bell icon. All these things. It doesn't matter. It does matter.
It matters so much.
Follow. Subscribe.
Like, review.
I'm done with calls to action.
Me too. All right. See you later, guys. Bye.
Bye.